Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Inna alhamdulillahi nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruhu wa na'udzu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina man yahdihillahu fala mudilla lahu wa man yudlil fala hadiya lahu wa ashhadu an la ilaha illa Allah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Allahumma salli ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala ali sayyidina Muhammadin wa barik wa sallam. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي ربي زدني علما ربي زدني علما ربي زدني علما ربي يسر ولا تعسر وتمم بالخير آمين يا رب العالمين. All right. Last time we stopped at this that the Muslims used to congregate secretly in Darul Arqam, and they were persecuted by the Quraysh. The persecutions, before the persecution, actually, we mentioned that the Quraysh had offered Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he would be given wealth and women and whatever he wanted if he just leaves his mission. And when nothing worked for them, they started persecuting the early Muslims. So the struggle of the early Muslims, Abdullah ibn Masud radiallahu anh, mentioned that the first group of the 7 that embraced Islam were Abu Bakr, Ammar radiallahu anh, Sumayya, Suhaib, Bilal, and Al-Miqdad. And they were severely persecuted. Bilal radiallahu anh, who was a slave, his master was one of the worst of the Quraysh. His name was Umayyah ibn Khalaf. And he persecuted him mercilessly. And what he would do was, he would personally take Bilal radiallahu anh into the desert and place a massive rock on his chest and leave him in the sun for the whole day. And another Sahabi by the name of Hassan ibn Sabit, who was a poet actually, he recalled that when he performed Hajj, he noticed how badly Bilal radiallahu anh was being punished, and he wondered if he was alive or not. That was the extent of the torture. And another Sahabi by the name of Amr ibn Alas radiallahu anh recalled that rocks were placed on Bilal, and they were so hot, those rocks that were placed on him, that even meat could be cooked on them. So just imagine the torture that Bilal radiallahu anh faced. And he, despite all this torture, he repeatedly say that he rejected Allah and Uzza, the chief gods of the Quraysh. Allah, Al-Uzza, and Manat, they were the 3 chief goddesses actually that the Quraysh worshipped, and they were also referred to as God's daughters. Tawba na'uzubillah. But despite the torture, Bilal radiallahu anh never gave in to what their demand was. He never uttered a single word to please them. And we know that later he became the muezzin of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In fact, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to Bilal radiallahu anh that give the azan even if you are alone, because no jinn or human will hear your voice except that they will testify to what you said on the day of judgment. So Bilal radiallahu anh had the honor of being Rasulullah's muezzin, and will therefore have the Rasulullah's testimony in front of Allah on the day of judgment. Another Sahabi, Khabbab ibn al-Arat, he was also one of the first 10 to embrace Islam, and he was an Arab slave of Yemeni origin. And he had a female master, and name of that female master was Anmar. When she found out that Khabbab had embraced Islam, she hired a mob to beat him so badly that he lost consciousness. And she would even take part in the torture. Sometimes what she used to do was used to hold a piece of burning iron against his back. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was so pained by Khabbab's torture that he made a dua to Allah that, "Oh Allah, please help Khabbab against the enemy." And what happened was, a few days later, this same woman, the female master, she woke up in a state of psychosis. And the doctors prescribed some treatment for her, which led to her death. Because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, after she died, Rasulullah commanded that no one should punish with fire except the Lord of Fire. And this is what she used to do. She used to punish with a burning iron, punish Khabbab with a burning iron rod. Then even Umar bin Khattab years later said about Khabbab that how he faced the torture, and what Khabbab radiallahu anh used to simply lift his shirt and expose his back to show the marks of the torture that he had been through. And Umar, who was so brave and courageous, he, looking at those marks, used to say that, "By Allah, I've not seen anything like this before." And he would place Khabbab radiallahu anh next to him as a show of honor to him. And this same man who was tortured so much, this same man, Khabbab radiallahu anh, when he was on his death bed, he began to cry. And the people who were around him, they asked him, "Why you are crying? You have suffered so much to reach the highest level and meet Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And imagine if we had gone through so much sacrifice for the sake of Allah, how convinced we would be that Allah will reward us." But he replied, and look at the reply of Khabbab. He said that, "I'm not crying out of the pain or a fear of meeting Allah. I'm crying because of what you see around you, that is in the house. How will I answer Allah about his luxury?" So the little luxury he had, he first of all, he considered it luxury, and his mindset was that he would be answerable to Allah about this luxury. So he was not thinking about the sacrifices that he had done for Islam, but for the little luxury, the little enjoyment that he had had in this world. Then the other group of Sahaba is the story of Yasir radiallahu anh. He was the son of Sumayya, and Yasir and Sumayya, they were husband and wife, and their son was Ammar. And they also faced severe torture at the hands of the Quraysh. And what was worse was that they were, Yasir, the dad, Sumayya, mom, and Ammar, the son, they were tortured in front of each other. So it is difficult to bear physical pain, but then to witness your loved one also being tortured is perhaps even more severe. And their torture was so severe that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made a special dua for them, that be patient, O family of Yasir, indeed your place is in paradise. And Yasir radiallahu anh was later, after the passing away of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was all brutally killed and he became the first martyr in Islam. And her mother, his mother, Ammar's mother, Sumayya, she was another brave lady that even though she was being tortured, she rebuked Abu Jahl. And Abu Jahl Abu Jahl murdered her in the most brutal manner. And he then killed Muhammad, who was the eldest son of this lady, not Ammar, the eldest son. And Ammar, who was only 15 years old at that time, could not bear the pain any longer, and he succumbed. He was just a 15-year-old boy, so he succumbed to Abu Jahl's demands outwardly by renouncing his faith. He said what they wanted him to say, that he believed in Allah and Uzza and Manat. And Ammar radiallahu anh was so distraught about what he had uttered that his worry about potentially committing disbelief was at the forefront of his mind. And he ran to Rasulullah because he was spared, because he had said what the Quraysh wanted to hear. But Ammar radiallahu anh, even though he was only 15 years old, he was so disturbed by what he had said that he ran to Rasulullah in despair and said that, "Oh Rasulullah, I have uttered words of kufr." And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked him that, "How did you find your heart?" He replied, "As it always was." That is, his faith is as strong as it always was, and his words did not depict what was in his heart. So the Prophet then reassured him that he had no blame and he was permitted to repeat these words if they tortured him again. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam sort of consoled him and gave him the permission to repeat the same words if he was tortured again. And Allah Ta'ala then revealed a verse from Surah Nahl, which goes, "Whoever disbelieves in Allah after their belief, not those who are forced while their hearts are firm in faith, but those who embrace disbelief wholeheartedly, they will be commanded by Allah and suffer a tremendous punishment." And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said about Ammar radiallahu anh that his iman has been filled in his heart all the way to his neck. That is, his faith is so strong that it is overflowing. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam also said that whenever the son of Sumayya is faced with two options, he always chooses the most correct of the two. So subhanallah, this is the testimony of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam about Sayyidina Ammar radiallahu anh. Then there was another Sahabi, a Roman one, Suhaib al-Rumi. He was known as Suhaib al-Rumi. Have I mentioned him here? I haven't mentioned him in this slide, but that was another Sahabi. And he was captured by a Byzantine force as a child, and he was enslaved in Rome. And he escaped from there and eventually reached Makkah. So when he reached Makkah, he was bought by Abdullah ibn Judan in Makkah. And even though his master did not torture him, but he did not prevent the likes of Abu Jahl from doing so. And his master was better than the other masters that we had just mentioned, and he granted Suhaib responsibilities in trade and granted him freedom in his will as well. When he died, he freed him, that if in the event of his death, that Suhaib should be set free. And when the master died, Suhaib radiallahu anh immigrated to Medina. But when he was migrating to Medina, he was stopped by the Quraysh on the outskirts. And Suhaib radiallahu anh took out his bow and arrow, saying that, I am the most accurate shooter, and I promise that none of you will be able to touch me until every arrow in my quiver will touch human flesh. And I promise that none of you will be able to touch me until my sword is bent and broken upon your bones and blood. So when he defiantly said this to them, they did not approach any further, but demanded that he leave his money behind if he wanted to continue his journey. So they were intimidated by his strength, but they still wanted his money. So not only did they demand his wealth, but they also insisted that he leave his horse behind and continue on foot. And then Suhaib radiallahu anh was faced with this choice, either to turn back with his wealth or continue to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam penniless and on foot. And Suhaib radiallahu anh thus became the only companion ever to perform hijrah on foot, leaving with nothing but the clothes on his back. That was the passion of the Sahaba Karam, our ancestors. And he reached Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Medina, actually in Masjid Quba, and he was looking disheveled, he was dehydrated, malnourished, and he was crawling on his hands and knees. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam personally received him and wiped the dust off him. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam smiled, and he repeated 3 times to Suhaib radiallahu anh that your trade was profitable, O Suhaib. And when he heard this, Suhaib, because obviously how would Rasulullah know that this had happened to Suhaib? And when Suhaib radiallahu anh heard this, he said, no one could have told you about that, O Rasulullah, except Jibreel alayhi salam. And Allah then revealed a beautiful verse regarding Suhaib al-Rumi, and that verse goes, and there are those who would sell themselves for Allah's pleasure, and Allah is ever gracious to his servants. So this verse, this ayat is, let me tell you, the ayat is from Surah Baqarah, ayah number 207, and this ayah is about none other but Suhaib radiallahu anh. So once the leaders of the Quraysh were conversing with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Abu Jahl intervened, pointing to Suhaib radiallahu anh, Bilal, and Ammar. So Abu Jahl pointed towards these 3, and what did he say? He said, we cannot accept being the subordinates of such people, so expel them. And Allah then revealed this ayat that is in front of you, Surah Al-An'am, ayah number 52. And what does it say? And do not send away those who call upon their Lord morning and afternoon, seeking his countenance. Not upon you is anything of their account, and not upon them is anything of your account. So were you to send them away, you would then be of the wrongdoers. Imagine the status of these 3 Sahaba that Allah Ta'ala revealed an ayah about them. And none of them were rich. They were slaves. They were poor, downtrodden people of the Meccan society. But their status in the eyes of Allah, their status in the eyes of the people of Makkah was very lowly, but the status in the eyes of Allah was very elevated. And Allah Ta'ala revealed this ayah about them. So now comes the immigration to Abyssinia. Now, since the persecution began, and there seemed to be no end at all to the persecution, and even Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was harassed and physically attacked. And this abuse escalated into assassination attempts, which eventually resulted in the hijrah. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was one of the few who prayed publicly in front of the Kaaba, which particularly annoyed Abu Jahl and his cronies. And Abu Jahl said that, I swear by Allah and Uzza, if I see that man again, I will put my foot on his neck and throw sand on him. And later that day, that when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam began praying in front of the Kaaba, Abu Jahl marched towards Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. However, as he approached, he suddenly stopped and began walking backwards. And when he was asked that what was happening, he said that I was about to step on him until I saw a pit of fire above which there were massive wings. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam later explained that those two wings belonged to angels, and had he taken one more step, they would have ripped him to shreds. So, as Prophet's enemies in Makkah, they were of two types. The first type were like the likes of Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anh and Amr ibn Alas radiallahu anh, who initially opposed the Prophet, but they did so with dignity. They did not resort to petty tactics. And they eventually all accepted Islam. The second type of enemies were like the likes of Abu Jahl and Abu Lahab, who not only opposed Rasulullah, but they did so shamelessly. They left no stone unturned in persecuting Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they did it in a very lowly manner. And Urwa ibn Zubair once asked Abdullah ibn Amr that what was the worst thing you saw happen to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Abdullah said that one day Rasulullah was praying in front of the Kaaba, and Uqba bin Abi Mu'ayth approached him from behind, took off his outer garment, threw it over the Prophet's neck, and began to choke him. And Rasulullah was struggling to breathe, and no one was intervening until Abu Bakr radiallahu anh was informed, and Abu Bakr ran over and pushed Uqba over and shouted, "Are you going to kill a man just because he says, my Lord is Allah?" So this was the extent of the persecution. And as time passed, the intensity grew, and acts of violence and aggression escalated. And news eventually spread that the Quraysh planned to assassinate Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then, considering all these extreme hardships, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam suggested to the Sahaba to migrate to Abyssinia, and this happened in the 5th year of the Dawah. And he suggested the Muslims to the companions to head to Abyssinia, which was ruled by a popular leader, Negus, and that was not the name, by the way. That was the title of the ruler. So, like in Persia, we had Khusro, and in Rome, we had Caesar. So, in Abyssinia, we had Negus. And he was a just Christian king. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam suggested to the companions that this land has become too constricted for you. So, for those who want to, why don't you immigrate to the neighboring land of Abyssinia? There is a Christian king there who is a just king, and he will allow you to worship Allah without interfering. So, as we know that the Dawah became public in the 3rd year of prophethood, and this immigration happened in the 5th year. So, during that time, the struggle and the torture became unbearable, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam then finally suggested that the companions, that if they want, they can move to or immigrate to Abyssinia. And this all indicates the extent of the difficulty that they endured in Makkah to even consider such a move, because moving is never easy. It brings its own challenges. Moving from one place, immigrating from one place to another, it always brings many challenges. And the first people to immigrate to Abyssinia were 12 men and 4 women. So total 14 people were the first group who immigrated to Abyssinia. And who were these first group? These were the people in the first group. So among them, you will be familiar with Usman ibn Affan with his wife Ruqayya. Ruqayya was the daughter of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Usman ibn Affan. He moved, and another Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, one of the Ashra Mubashira, Zubair ibn al-Awwam, Musab ibn Umair, Usman ibn Mazun. This is another Usman in Seerah. Jafar ibn Abi Talib, Abu Salama and Salama. Salama later becomes the wife of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Jahash ibn Riyab, Abdullah ibn Jahash, Abu Huzaifa ibn Utba, Sahla bint Suhail, Amr ibn Rabi'a, Layla bint Abi Hatm. So these were the people who migrated to Abyssinia. And it may be noted that all of them were noblemen and women of the Quraysh. And there was a notable absence of the servant class Muslims, the slaves. Why? Because they did not have the freedom to immigrate despite needing it the most. Even though they were tortured the most, they did not have this luxury to immigrate because they were slaves. And even Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, he made the intention to join them. But what happened was, as he embarked, the chief of a neighboring tribe saw him leaving, and he asked him why he was leaving. And Abu Bakr had a good relationship with this chief. So he asked Abu Bakr that why you are leaving, and Abu Bakr related the story to him. So upon hearing the story, the chief said that someone like you does not deserve to leave the land of Makkah. If your people have persecuted you, let me go and speak on your behalf and grant you my protection. Now, Abu Bakr's tribe had relinquished their tribal protection to this chief. And as he was not from the Quraysh, this chief was not from the Quraysh, he was required to seek permission from the Quraysh. And as a trade partner and a neighboring tribe leader, the Quraysh accepted this, but on one condition, that Abu Bakr radiallahu anh must not pray publicly. So other than Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Abu Bakr radiallahu anh was one of the only people fearless enough to pray in front of the Kaaba, and the Quraysh complained that it was impacting the people. So Abu Bakr agreed and instead make an extension to his house as a makeshift mosque, and he continued to pray within the house for some time. However, Abu Bakr's recitation was very moving and emotional. And Ibn Ishaq narrates that the women and children of the Quraysh would gather outside his house in amazement and marvel at his recitation. And Amma Aisha radiallahu anha once mentioned about her father that he was a man who would be easily brought to tears out of emotion. So even though Abu Bakr abided by the condition and prayed in his house, but due to his the impact of his emotional recitation, even from within the house, the people used to gather outside his house to listen to his recitation. And when the Quraysh heard this, they sent a message to the chief to inform Abu Bakr and ban his recitation even from within the house because it was impacting the people. And then the chief requested Abu Bakr to stop praying aloud, or else he would withdraw his protection. And Abu Bakr then, radiallahu anh, resolutely replied that I return your protection and accept the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Abu Bakr radiallahu anh remained in Makkah, relying solely on his trust in Allah. Now, the Prophet's suggestion of Hijrah demonstrates that not all non-Muslim lands are the same. Abyssinia and Makkah were both non-Muslim, but Abyssinia allowed a freedom of religion while Makkah was hostile. And the companions who immigrated, they did not immediately return once Medina was established as a Muslim land. In fact, they remained in Abyssinia for 14 years, and the Prophet only recalled them after the Battle of Khaybar. So they remained there for 14 years. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam chose Abyssinia for a number of reasons. As mentioned before, Negus was a man of justice and integrity, and that's why he sent the Muslims there. Then Abyssinia was also they had some trade links with it, so they were relatively familiar with the place. And in addition to that, they were Christians who were much more cordial uh, because they were the Ahle Kitab and they had the shared notion of prophethood. So they were more cordial to the Muslims. And upon hearing about the Prophet's teachings, Negus said this comes from the same well as that of Prophet Musa. That means from the same God as that of Prophet Musa. So this is what happened to the early Muslims, that they were forced to migrate to Abyssinia. But not everybody. Some of them migrated, and the slaves were not allowed to migrate. Now, the first batch of immigrants, initially, as I had mentioned before, that they stayed there for 14 years, but initially they did return to Mecca after a mere 3 months due to a misunderstanding. An event occurred which led to rumors that the Quraysh had finally accepted Islam, which prompted the Muslims to hastily return to Mecca. So even though these immigrants, they had safety and they have had freedom to practice their faith, they had an extremely difficult time adjusting to life in a foreign country with a new language and culture and norms and climate. And they were still beginning to adjust when they heard the rumors that the Quraysh accepted Islam, and so they uh, pounced on the idea of returning home. Now, what happened? What event happened? The famous incident is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam reciting Surah Najm in public. So, as Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam recited Surah Najm in its entirety in public, an audience started gathering. Now, this surah, Surah Najm, is a particularly powerful surah with a lot of rhetorical devices used, captivating the listeners. And the surah then builds up to its climax, and it ends with a ayah of prostration: prostrate to Allah and worship Him. Now, when this ayah was reached, not only did all the Muslims immediately prostrate, but the pagans of the Quraysh were so overwhelmed and captivated that they could not help but to fall into prostration too. So everybody fell into prostration, apart from Walid ibn al-Mughira, who was too arrogant. And what he did was he just wiped some dust on his forehead. Apart from him, the entirety of Makkah went into prostration. And this unprecedented event inevitably led to rumors that the Quraysh had accepted Islam, and prompting the Muslims in Abyssinia to return. Now, this event is is an infamous event. It is not controversial. However, there are versions of this narration in very weak reports that have caused some controversy. Now, what I have told you just now about the Quraysh listening to the recitation of Surah Najm and falling into prostration, this is reported in the most authentic work in Islamic history, and that is the Sahih Bukhari. The remaining versions are not only absent in the six books, the Sihah Sitta, the 6 books of Hadith, but they are also not present in the primary sources of Ibn Hisham and Ibn Ishaq. And they only appear in the most obscure of references. But they also appear in the tafsir of Al-Tabari, famous Mufassir. Now, it must be made clear that Imam Bukhari, when he collected the ahadith, his aim was to compile the most authentic of narrations. And Imam Tabari, when he did his tafsir, he distinctly clarified that this text is a compilation of all the reports, not solely the authentic ones. So, in an inauthentic version of this report, it was narrated by Urwa ibn Zubair, who was a successor and who was a tabi'i, and he did not meet Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam directly. He reports that Shaitan cried out, adding 2 verses heard only by the polytheists. Okay, now please bear this in mind that this is an inauthentic version, but I'm bringing it to your attention because it is out there. The authentic version, we have mentioned that the Quraysh heard the captivating recitation of Surah Najm and they fell into prostration. Now, this version also appears, and it appears in a tafsir of Imam Tabari, who was a very famous Mufassir. And he says that Shaitan uttered and he cried out and he added 2 verses. And these 2 verses were heard only by the pagans of Makkah. And according to this report, Shaitan added some verses that were clearly praising the idols. And the Quraysh had assumed that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had finally compromised. And so they were happy to prostrate. They assumed that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had compromised on Tawheed, and they therefore prostrated. And then there is a third and even more problematic version. So the first version is the authentic version that we have mentioned, that they heard the recitation and then fell into prostration. The second version is that that Shaitan had added 2 verses which were only heard by the pagans, and they thought that Rasulullah and these 2 verses were glorifying their idols. And the Quraysh thought that the Rasulullah had compromised, and so they were happy to prostrate. Now there is a third version, which is even more problematic. And this version says that Shaitan impersonated Jibreel alayhi salam, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam could not distinguish between the two. He could not distinguish that this was Shaitan, and he repeated the verses that Shaitan repeated. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said the verses that the Shaitan said to him. But we deny these 2 versions, these 2 inauthentic versions, because we do not have any evidence to support them. Okay. As I said, Imam Tabari has mentioned in his tafsir, but Imam Tabari had categorically said that he will compile his all reports, not solely the authentic ones, all reports that exist out there. So There are three versions of what happened. We believe in the first version, and this is quoted by Imam Bukhari, who had collected the most authentic narrations. And we believe that when Rasulullah recited Surah Najm, the recitation was so captivating that the Quraysh fell into prostration when the ayah of prostration came. And the other two that I have mentioned are out there, but they are inauthentic, and we reject them because they are very problematic. Anyway, the immigrants journeyed to Makkah. They came from Abyssinia to Makkah. And as they were on the outskirts of the city, they asked a passerby about the Quraysh accepting Islam, to which they were informed that the rumor was false. So they were very deflated and disappointed, and they considered returning to Abyssinia, but they loved their hometown of Makkah, and it was just within reach, and they yearned to reunite with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they decided to return to Makkah. And now that they were returning to Makkah, they needed to seek new protection, so that they could practice their religion. And Usman ibn Mazun, I remember there were two Usman who had migrated to Abyssinia. The second Usman, Usman ibn Mazun, he reached out to his old friend Walid ibn Mughira for protection. And as Walid ibn Mughira was one of the most powerful men in Makkah, his protection ensured that Usman was completely safe. But meanwhile, he saw, that is Usman ibn Mazun saw the rest of the Muslims being persecuted while he was safe, and he was consumed by guilt. And his feelings of guilt grew to be unbearable, and eventually he asked for his protection to be revoked. Even though he did not do anything wrong and he had every right to seek out his own protection, but his conscience would not allow him to continue in peace while his companions were suffering. And shortly after having his protection revoked, Usman ibn Mazun passed by a gathering which included one of Arabia's most talented poets, Labid, who had been invited to Makkah. And Labid recited a line of poetry that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would later describe as the most truthful statement that any poet has ever said. And what was that statement? For truly everything except Allah is a replacement. And Usman ibn Mazun was truly impressed and exclaimed that you have spoken the truth. And Labid continued, and every pleasure will undoubtedly cease. And Usman again retorted that you have lied, because paradise will never disappear. So one part of it was very pleasing, and even Rasulullah had commented about it later on. But the second part, that every pleasure will undoubtedly cease, Usman radiallahu said that you have lied, because paradise will never disappear. And when Labid heard this, he became fumed, saying, since when have you people treated your guests in this manner? And somebody stood up and punched Usman in the face, giving him a black eye. And when Walid heard, he said, my nephew, he wasn't really his nephew, but this is just a term of endearment. Why did you revoke my protection? And please allow me to reinstate it. And Usman ibn Mazun replied, no, indeed, my other eye is in need of the blessings incurred by this eye. That means one eye has got black. I don't mind if my other eye also gets black. So this is what happened to the early migrants who came back to Makkah, the early migrants who went to Abyssinia and then returned to Makkah, hearing the rumor that the Quraysh had accepted Islam. So after a short while in Makkah, these immigrants decided it was better to return to Abyssinia. Because despite Makkah being their homeland, Abyssinia provided safety and security and health and sustenance are indeed important human need. So they thought that they would be better off living in Abyssinia. So more than 80 Muslims decided to immigrate. So first there were only 14 and now more than 80 Muslims decided to immigrate, which was around half of the Muslims in Makkah and actually more than 10% of the entire population. So losing such a significant portion of the population was humiliating for the Quraysh, and they could not tolerate such shame. So what they did was they sent Amr ibn Alas, who had not yet converted to Islam, to go to Negus and to lobby the Negus to order the return of these Muslims. And Amr ibn Alas was an extremely intelligent man and shrewd politician who was an ideal man for this job. So he eventually used his talents for the betterment of Islam, and later on he accepted Islam. But at this point, he was still a non-Muslim. So he, alongside another delegate, went to Negus with gifts from Makkah, and they gave the ministers and Negus expensive gifts, saying that you have in your midst a group of renegades and rebels, and we will speak to the Negus tomorrow about their case, and we want you to hand them back to us and support us in this cause. And when you give Negus his gifts, remember our gifts to you. So the next day they approached Negus, and then they will try to persuade Negus to let them go. So we will stop here for today and then continue next week about what happened when Amr ibn Alas reached the court of Negus and trying to negotiate a deal with Negus so that the Muslims may be returned. So we'll stop here for today. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت ونستغفرك ونتوب إليك آمين يا رب العالمين. Jazakallah khair for listening. Inshallah, we'll carry on next week.